Okay, so we are right at noon, and in terms of honoring our everyone's time, I would just like to welcome everyone to our session. And my name is Karen Scott Bars, and I'm greeting you from Treaty 6 territory in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. My Sask Polytech colleagues and I are situated across the province on the traditional lands of the Dakota, Dene, Lakota, Nakota, Nehiyaw, and Plains Ojibwe nations, and in the homelands of the Métis Nation. I'm deeply grateful to live and work alongside those whose people have lived in harmony with these lands for time immemorial. I'm also grateful to have been one of the two-time recipients of open education grants administered through Sask Polytech Library and provided by the government of Saskatchewan, and to be among the many in our School of Nursing where I work and Sask Polytech who are very committed to deepening our attention to Indigenous knowledges within our teaching, learning, resources, and community as a whole. And so I'm feeling very lucky to host today's session and to be able to learn from our panel of speakers. One housekeeping item, we are in a conference style Zoom. So that means that you can see us, but we can't see you. And do feel free to type questions or comments into the chat or the Q&A. Q&A is best for the questions, in the chat, your name, of course, as you would know, will appear with your comment. And I will gather questions from both those areas just to make sure we don't miss anything. And then we can have a Q&A session at the end. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Aidan Megan, who is the director of our library and member of the Open Education Award team at Sask Polytech. And Aidan will be introducing our speakers.
Thank you, Karen. Saskatchewan Polytechnic has been working with the government of Saskatchewan to support the development of open education resources since 2016. As we know, many learners face a financial barrier to education, and after tuition, textbooks are often the highest cost for our students. Our library works with faculty to create resources to benefit our students using these grant funds and to host this annual celebration of Open Education Week so that we can support active sharing and learning about the latest achievements in open education. Today, we're very pleased to have a panel of speakers to share this knowledge with us today. We have Kayla Larson, and she is Indigenous Programs and Services Librarian for the Kwewa Library at UBC. Did I get that, Kayla? Good. And Program Manager Librarian for Indigitization. We also have Donna Lanjo, and she's the Community Engagement and Open Education Librarian at the University of British Columbia Okanagan campus. We also have Tasha Kutniyu, and she's the current president of the University of British Columbia Student Union in Okanagan. And last, we have Brad Weatherick, and he is the Associate Provost of Academic Programs, Teaching and Learning at UBC Okanagan. Thank you all for joining us today.
So thank you so much for the introduction and the warm welcome. I will ask my colleague Kayla to pull up the slides. So we're really excited here to speak to you today about Indigenous knowledges and open education. If you can go to the next slide, this is just a slightly more expanded version of the introductions that were just given. I want to acknowledge a fifth member of our team who isn't actually able to be here with us today, named Cardinal, who is at UBC Okanagan with our Indigenous Programs and Services team. He has been instrumental in bringing us to the point today where we're talking to you. But four of us are Indigenous. We have various backgrounds in both Indigenous education and open education. and we're really excited to kind of come together as a team to work on this project and to be here together with you today to present. Before we go further, though, I do want to acknowledge that I'm located here in the Okanagan, which is the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of the Silks Okanagan Nation. And I want to acknowledge that one of my presenters is actually located in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people in Vancouver. And again, as has already been done, acknowledge the original peoples of the lands in Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, as well as the traditional homeland of the Métis. We are, part of this initiative is really, or part of our work in this space is really to advance how do we move forward with indigenizing higher education. And I wanted to start our conversation with a framework that many of you may know from Gaudry and Lorenz a few years ago, talking about how do we think about indigenizing higher education, understanding the work that we're doing within a spectrum of activity. And in this really wonderful article, I encourage you to read, Gaudry and Lorenz talk about Indigenous inclusion as a way in which many institutions are actually thinking about indigenizing higher education. And Indigenous inclusion really defined as focusing on increasing both the number and the presence of Indigenous students, faculty, and staff within their academic community. And it's supporting the adaptation of Indigenous peoples into the current institutional context within higher education. The second part of their continuum is reconciliation indigenization, which locates indigenization on the common ground between Indigenous and Western ideals. And it really engages in debates about what counts as knowledge and the reconciliation of these diverse knowledges within the academy. And then their final frame of thinking about indigenization is really decolonial indigenization, which is fundamentally reorienting knowledge production based on balancing power relations between Indigenous peoples and Canadians. This idea of transforming the academy into something dynamic and something new. And what we're going to talk to you about today is really this journey of thinking about Indigenous knowledges and the intersection of open education as two major initiatives on our campus and on many campuses across the country. If you go to the next slide, Kayla, Indigenous knowledges at UBC is a major focus of our institution. We have released in 2020 what I consider a really transformative Indigenous strategic plan that sets a vision for UBC as a leading university globally in the implementation of Indigenous people's human rights. And within that Indigenous strategic plan, it's meant to guide our engagement with Indigenous peoples and our commitments to reconciliation across the institution. There are 8 goals under this plan, and within those 8 goals, 43 actions. And I wanted to highlight just 4 of those actions really briefly, just to kind of emphasize a little bit of what we're talking about. So action 8 in our plan is around providing free and publicly accessible educational tools, events, and resources that promote the local global implementation of Indigenous human rights, TRC calls to action, and national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls for justice. So part of our plan is explicitly around providing these free and open educational tools and resources, and understanding kind of the intersection with these particular calls to action and calls to justice around having that Indigenous perspective brought into that work. Action 13 is around co-developing research protocols and community-specific ethical research guidelines with interested community partners to ensure students and faculties are approaching research opportunities with communities in a respectful and formalized manner that includes the imperative of free, prior, and informed consent and protocols on the ownership, control, access, and position of Indigenous data and Indigenous knowledges. So it's really centering this idea of understanding what does consent mean for Indigenous communities who are engaging in the development of educational resources, and what does it mean for Indigenous communities to own, control, and access and possess their own data and their own knowledges. And so that is a key part of our plan too. Action 15 is undertaking a university-wide faculty-level curriculum review to ensure Indigenous histories, experiences, worldviews, and knowledge systems are appropriately integrated into all faculties, and that we're fully compliant with the TRC calls to action. So this is really around this idea of actually bringing Indigenous perspectives, Indigenous knowledges into our courses and curriculum, and understanding how do we do that effectively. And Action 31 is to develop information repositories and communication portals that assist students, faculty, staff, communities, and researchers at large to access resources, publications, reports around Indigenous issues and Indigenous knowledges. So we're making a commitment to making sure that we're providing that open repository, that open portal for communities to understand and access Indigenous knowledges. So what does it mean for us to actually do that in a way that is reflecting appropriate institution or appropriate protocols from a community perspective? If you go to the next slide, this is happening within a context, indigenizing within a context that includes a deep focus on both accessibility and affordability. So access to educational opportunities, reducing barriers to learning opportunities and learning materials is a major focus of what we're doing. And reducing the cost of educational materials has been a major part of this. So we're just launching the report of an affordability task force that was really driven jointly between the teaching and learning and student affairs communities with our student government, both in Vancouver and the Okanagan, to focus on what does it mean to have accessible educational materials. And in the Okanagan, we actually have a Senate policy that actually explicitly says that we're not able to, that students should be able to have free access to educational materials that are particularly used for assessment purposes. So what does it mean to actually think about open education within that context? And of course, I need to acknowledge the broader BC context in which open education is a major initiative, has been a major focus of work for many years. In fact, actually, we are just celebrating BC Campus's 10th anniversary of their open textbook initiative and their open textbook portal. So I wanted to acknowledge that context within which UBC resides. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kayla, who's really going to dive into the meat of our work. So.
Thanks, Brad. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for having me today. What I will be talking about primarily will be Indigenous OERs and knowledges, and kind of reshaping and rethinking about some of the aspects of OERs, such as the 5 R's of OERs, and how we can fit Indigenous knowledges into open educational resources in a way that's collaborative with communities, really centers community voices, as well as done in a way that respects Indigenous knowledge sharing protocols, and kind of creates OERs and looks at them in a transformative way that follows some of the policies that Brad has been talking about, such as the TRC, our ISP here at UBC and beyond. So first, we've talked about Indigenous knowledges a lot, but what exactly are Indigenous knowledges? Unless you are continuously working with Indigenous knowledges or from a community, it's always great to start off with kind of a basis of what exactly Indigenous knowledges are. Mind you, when I go through and talk about Indigenous knowledges, this is a very academic perspective on what Indigenous knowledges are. However, these are from Indigenous academics out there. However, communities might have differing opinions on what knowledges are. But in general, when we're talking about Indigenous knowledges, and this comes from Leanne Simpson, Indigenous knowledges are holistic, cyclic, and dependent upon relationships and connections to living and non-living beings and entities. There are many truths within Indigenous knowledges, and these truths are dependent upon individual experiences. Additionally, everything is seen as being alive and all things are equal. For Indigenous folks, the land is sacred and relationships between people and the spiritual world are important. Human beings are often seen as being the least important thing in the world. Additionally, Indigenous knowledges are evolved from 3 different types of knowledges. So we have traditional knowledges, which are living chronicles of origins, trajectories, and achievements of Indigenous peoples. Additionally, we have empirical knowledges, which are careful observations and relationships to humans and non-humans. These knowledges are ecological and accumulated over time. And then we have revealed knowledges. So sometimes knowledges are revealed to individuals through things like dreams, visions, and intuition. And from these different types of knowledges, we have in general 3 different knowledges that we can break down from there. So these are the types of Indigenous knowledges that often we see within academia or within our everyday life and form Indigenous data. So we first of all have traditional knowledges, often seen as the abbreviation TK. So traditional knowledges are knowledges, know-hows, and skills and practices that are developed, sustained, and passed on from generation to generation within a community. And often traditional knowledges are part of the formation of that community's cultural and spiritual identity. Another form of knowledge that we see are Indigenous cultural expressions. So they are slightly similar to traditional knowledges as they often incorporate traditional knowledges into them. But when we see Indigenous cultural expressions, they're a little bit more tangible. So they're things like dances, regalia, designs, and songs. So we can see here the Cowichan jacket. So there is traditional knowledge that goes into the design of the jacket, the story behind the jacket. However, it's a cultural expression as it's a more physical thing. In general, within a Canadian context, Indigenous cultural expressions are a lot easier to cover under Canadian copyright law. And this is where we see the copyright challenges more often when it comes to ownership over designs, songs, etc. And additionally, the last type of knowledge that often we see that forms Indigenous data are biocultural resources. So biocultural resources include microorganisms, plant varieties, animals, etc. There's lots of work coming out of universities in Aotearoa, so in New Zealand, and Maori academics doing a lot of work on how do we protect biocultural resources and knowledges in a way that aligns with Maori protocols to knowledge sharing. So our relatives there are really leading the work in this kind of sector of Indigenous knowledge protection. So we've talked about knowledges, how they form, the 3 different types of knowledges, and all these come together in academia to form Indigenous data. So in general, with Indigenous data, we have data on Indigenous resources and environments. So this is things like land data, water information, titles, geological information. Then we have data about Indigenous demographics or social data. And this is our legal data, health data, education. One thing about data that is about Indigenous demographics or social data is it can include Indigenous created data, so community created data. So often we see this as community created data about statistics about those living within communities or in urban communities. Sometimes these could be partnered with other agencies such as municipal, federal, and provincial governments, but it can be both, so government data as well as community driven. And then we have data from Indigenous communities. So data from Indigenous communities often has traditional cultural data, archives, oral literature, ancestral knowledge, and community stories. So really, when we're speaking about Indigenous data and Indigenous data that goes into OERs, it really is a larger blanket term for many different types of Indigenous knowledges and resources that come out of the, that are created out of Indigenous knowledge and knowledge sharing. With this knowledge sharing and these resources often comes very specific protocols. So Indigenous protocols to knowledge and data sharing really are based on laws that come from that community and will differ from community to community because of that. Usually these protocols use collective knowledges within the community. And like I said, they follow those laws. So something that are like knowledge sharing protocols for Musqueam would not be the same as communities like Silks in the Okanagan, or Cree communities, Nahio, Blackfoot. All different communities across Canada will have their own knowledge sharing protocols. However, if we break it down, usually these protocols have kind of similar themes. So there's ownership and inheritance. This usually comes at a clan level or a familial level. Knowledges are often earned. In Indigenous communities. It can take a very long time to learn specific stories, specific knowledges. So knowledges are earned, as well as age. Age can affect the protocols of sharing knowledge. Gender identity, geography, and seasons. In my own community, we are just coming out of storytelling season, and there's many stories that are that should only be shared in the winter months, and we're just coming out of that. And then there's techniques. Altogether, when we look at Indigenous data, it forms into Indigenous research and funnels into Indigenous research. So Indigenous research is very different from kind of a Western understanding of research. And we really have seen in the last decade or so, this uptake in Indigenous research, and with Indigenous academics coming in and really transforming the way that Indigenous people are centered within academia. So often Indigenous research is community driven. It includes all of our relations. So that's those who are from the land, the sky, our ancestors. And it's accountable, and that accountability is really important. It brings in Indigenous worldviews and centers Indigenous worldviews as authority within an academic setting, and also includes Indigenous laws and protocols within research. So how does this all fit into OERs, and what exactly is an OER? Hopefully you were able to see some of the other sessions that might have been happening for OER week, as OER week has been going on across Canada, and lots of institutions are having different workshops about OERs. But let's talk about kind of the basic of what an OER is for anyone that maybe missed that, because it will be important for talking about Indigenous OERs. So what exactly is an OER? And I am so thankful to Donna, because Donna really is the expert in what an OER is. I more talk about Indigenous knowledges and how they kind of intersect with this. So this is a really good, I'm always thankful for Donna and her knowledges when it comes to OERs. But in general, OERs, so open educational resources, are teaching, learning, and research resources that are created with the intention of being freely available to users. They include things like textbooks, etc. Most are covered by licenses that allow for using, remixing, and sharing. And they really do break down barriers for authors when it comes to publishing. As well, due to their openness, often paywall barriers are alleviated when we use OERs. For our OERs, there are about 5 R's of OERs. The first one is retain. So retain is the right to make, own, and control copies of content. The next is reuse. So this is the right to use content in a wide variety of ways. Next, we have revise. So this is the right to adapt, adjust, modify, or alter the content itself. And then remix, the right to combine the original or revised content with other open content to create something new. And then redistribute. So the right to share copies of the original content, your revisions, or your remixes with others. And this comes from David Wiley. So those are the 5 R's of OERs. And really think about these, kind of get a mental picture of what the 5 R's of OERs are, because this will be important when looking at the 6 R's of Indigenous OERs. All right, so Indigenous content in OERs. Where does Indigenous knowledges fit? It's first important to really reiterate, though, before looking at Indigenous knowledges in OERs and the complexity of incorporating Indigenous knowledges into OERs, is that Indigenous nations here in Canada have the right to be sovereign. So what this means is that the government of Canada recognizes Indigenous peoples and that they have a right to remain sovereign and practice self-governance, and this is through Section 35 of the Constitution. What Indigenous self-government is a formal structure through which Indigenous communities may control the administration of their people, land, resources, and related programs and policies. So this can be through things like agreements with government agencies at all levels and institutions. So often we see this also with education and educational structures, and this can be on reserve usually, but there is this also in urban communities. One aspect of Indigenous sovereignty that we often see being challenged is the understanding of Indigenous data sovereignty. So Indigenous data sovereignty is a principle, it's not a legal practice, but it's the understanding that Indigenous nations have the right to ownership and governance over data about them, regardless of where it is held and who holds it. Additionally, it is an understanding that Indigenous nations have the right to govern data in a way that aligns with their own protocols and laws. And it's an understanding that Indigenous people have the right to access data that supports nation rebuilding. So this often includes access to government documents, both historic and contemporary and archival documents. With Indigenous data sovereignty, it's often challenged by things like Canadian copyright law that does not necessarily recognize that Indigenous peoples have the right to the ownership of their traditional knowledge, and there's many reasons for this. So one of the things that we like to look at is open access principles and how we can modify them to incorporate Indigenous knowledges. So this, the FAIR and CARE principles come from GIDA, which is the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So what GIDA's done is they've taken the principles of FAIR, which is for open access, it stands for findability, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and added on another section, so FAIR and CARE. And CARE is for Indigenous knowledge. It stands for collective benefit, authority of control, responsibility, and ethics. So we can take principles and practices of open access and then add on other considerations for how we can work ethically with communities and respect community protocols when it comes to open access, while also looking at principles of data sovereignty and Indigenous knowledge sharing sovereignty and bringing that in as well. So when we're looking at OERs and building OERs and working with communities to have open educational resources, really we have to first think about who is the audience, because this will shape the way that we build our OER, and it will shape the way in which we work with the content. So when we're working with an OER, we have to think, which community is actually driving this? Is it an Indigenous community? Is this an OER that is being produced by a community? Or is this an OER that's being created by maybe an educational institution like a university for classroom use? Or is this something that might be used for settler education? Additionally, when we're looking at an OER, we have to think about the age range, the educational level of the users of the OER, and then what exactly is the geography. So are we looking at knowledges within a local context, an international, or more of like the national context? Because the range of knowledges and the protocols that we then have to be considerate of in the OER will be different. Next, we have content and context. So we have to think about what exactly are the knowledges that are being shared and what knowledges are appropriate to actually share. Are there any protocols that need to be adhered to, and how can we support the adherence of these protocols? So what protocols would the community want within this OER, or do we have to be considerate of using tools to help us with protocols when we don't actually know what a protocol might be for a specific knowledge? Is there any consent that needs to come from the community to share the information that is being presented within the OER? And additionally, is this information that we're sharing a primary source or is it secondary? So are these oral testimonies from community members, from elders, or is this additional information that's coming from something like a textbook that's already being created? Is it a primary or secondary source? And really what we want to do is let Indigenous peoples take the lead and to uplift their voices. So it's really important when working with Indigenous knowledges to consult with community and let them take the lead on what content and knowledges should be included in an OER that has an Indigenous focus. It's also important to really build capacity with communities to create OERs at all steps and to consult as long as it is not a burden to the community. And I also want to reiterate, Indigenous communities are very busy, but we do have a duty to consult. Additionally, we want to build relationships with communities. So what especially being an Indigenous librarian here at UBC, one of the things that I incorporate into my practice is the 4 R's of Indigenous education and the Longhouse. And what these 4 R's did is I took these and used them to think differently about OERs. As I already work with these worldviews every day, the library that I work with, the Huihua Library, is aligned with the Longhouse. We are together like sisters. The Longhouse at UBC has values that the staff members and students work with it. And these values are respect, relationships, responsibility, and reverence. Additionally, there's 4 R's of Indigenous education, which are fairly similar, and these are from Kirkness and Barnhart, and they're respect, relevance, they're reciprocal, and responsibility as well. So I tried to take these 4 R's and use them in a way that made sense for me when looking at OERs. Okay, so thinking back to those 5 R's that came about OERs, really those 5 R's do not fit within kind of the understanding of how we should be working with Indigenous OERs and the different protocols and responsibilities that come with sharing Indigenous knowledges. So what I did was kind of took the 4 R's, mixed them together, and then created the 6 R's of Indigenous OERs. And what the 6 R's are respect. So respect for Indigenous cultural identity, communities, and topics. And then we have relationships. Relationships connects to the concept of all of our relations. So thinking back on relationality with Indigenous communities and building also relationships with communities. So thinking about the concept of all of our relations is also bringing in kind of that spiritual practice and thinking about our ancestors and the land and our relationship with the land and the place that we are now. Additionally, there's responsibility. So we have a responsibility to share only when we are allowed and to publish in an ethical way, considering things like ownership, protocol, and community practices. Additionally, there's reverence. So the respect for the sacred, respect for knowledges and holding Indigenous knowledges up. And then there's relevance. So legitimizing and incorporating Indigenous knowledges into the curriculum when it makes sense. And then lastly, I did put in reciprocity. I think it's important to be reciprocal, to give back to communities, as it is really a privilege for communities to share their knowledges with us. So there has to be this reciprocity when working and giving back. And so now we have the student perspective, and I will pass it over to Tashia.
Thank you, Kayla. My name is Tashia, and today I'm going to be talking about the student perspective around Indigenous knowledges and open education. So I have 2 slides in a small period of your time today. So we just move right over to our first slide. So obviously we're situated in British Columbia, so my slides kind of speak if there's any statistics or anything around that. So in British Columbia, there are 26% of students that choose to not enroll in classes due to required textbook purchase. The high cost of textbooks is accessibility barrier for students, and the commercial textbooks industry has been making huge profits off students who are already facing ever increasing tuition fees and student loan debt. So when we talk about the student perspective of open, this is commonly in any consultation I've done with faculty or the administration is, well, students love open because of the fact that it reduces their textbook costs. When I learned what open education was, this was about 3 years ago, and I joined the student union movement, and they were looking for someone to co-chair a working group. Now, I got wrapped into this and found out there was no working group, and so we had to do a lot of legwork at UBC Okanagan to make that happen. And alongside that, the more I learned about open and the ways that it not only addresses affordability, but equity, and it is also very intentional, as Kayla just showed with all of the research and everything, I started to wonder, there is another campaign that my student union runs, and if you move to the next slide, and it was called Reconciliation Through Education. And that's really all there was to it. It said, it had the statistics here of your enrollment of Indigenous students to non-Indigenous students. The campaign spoke to the fact that 10% of Indigenous people hold a university degree compared to 31% of non-Indigenous people in British Columbia. It talked about the increasing proportion of Indigenous people with university degrees, but that there was a gap there, obviously, and we wanted to shrink that, not widen it. But there wasn't any deliverables on this campaign. It didn't really speak to what me as a student leader advocating around open or any other issue was supposed to do with it. And as Brad talked, there's lots of things that UBC does that are unique and very intentional and make me feel very included in my university environment with the upholding of the TRC recommendations. But for me and for other students, the question was, how do we place value in the TRC recommendations for post-secondary education to integrate Indigenous knowledges and methods in the classroom? And for me, that meant having an event and starting to start the conversation on our campus around these two important issues that both address affordability, accessibility, and inclusion for students in a meaningful way. And so when we talk about the student perspective, it's not only about students wanting to have less affordable, make post-secondary education more affordable, but it's actually for students such as myself that are Indigenous to feel that they have a place in the university, not just as an Indigenous voice, but that our teaching, our knowledges are integrated into the system in a meaningful and intentional way. It starts to show Indigenous students on our campus that we are thinking about them and we are working towards them, and that we aren't just saying reconciling through education as a phrase to denote the value of inclusivity, but we're actually placing value in that. So when we talk about the student perspective here, that is what we're looking for. We're looking to make sure that the students in our classroom feel seen and they feel respected and they feel that the learning experience they're a part of is also thinking of them. So I'm going to hand it over to Donna for our next piece.
Thank you, Tashia, and thank you so much for having us here today. And thank you to my colleagues and co-presenters for sharing their knowledges. I'm going to talk a little bit about the event that Tashia had mentioned. Our team came together to host the first Indigenous Knowledges and Open Education Symposium. So Kayla, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. And I do really want to give a shout out here to Tashia for kind of for her incredible work moving this event forward. As Tashia mentioned, at UBC Okanagan, we have an open education working group of which Tashia and I are both the co-chairs. And our open education working group had many discussions about how we could center Indigenous ways of knowing, culture experiences, and worldviews within our open education advocacy work. So we had the idea, or Tashia had the idea, for the Indigenous Knowledges and Open Education Symposium. To plan this event, we partnered with the Provost's Office, the library, and Indigenous Programs and Services, as well as the Center for Teaching and Learning. This event happened in October 2021. It was a half-day event, starting with a welcome from local Syilx elders, Pamela and Gross Barnes, followed by an amazing keynote by Kayla Larson. The second half of the event featured a panel conversation with Indigenous scholars working in the field of either open education or higher education. The speakers included Christian Isbister, Indigenous Initiatives Librarian at UBC Okanagan, Dr. Carrie Charnley, Assistant Professor of Teaching in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at UBC Okanagan, and Jewel Gillies, who works in the Aboriginal Services Department of Okanagan College. We had an amazingly successful event with over 190 people registering, and this included faculty, students, librarians, as well as community members from locations all over the world. Some of the questions that we posed to the panelists included, how can we incorporate Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing into our open educational practices or higher education more broadly? What benefit is there to students and teachers when we indigenize our teaching and learning materials? In what ways is the open education movement in conflict or tension with Indigenous knowledges and ways of knowing? And lastly, in what ways does the open education movement contribute to decolonizing and or indigenizing higher education? And I wanted to speak to some of the themes that emerged from the conversation, which I know some of these Kayla had also mentioned throughout her presentation as well. The first one being that we should approach relationships and collaborative work with Indigenous communities thoughtfully, carefully, and respectfully. And that there are diverse perspectives within Indigenous knowledges. Indigenous knowledges and worldviews are not homogeneous. Jewel Gillies had used the term naturalizing Indigenous knowledges and worldviews and added that it should not be considered an add-on, that this should really be considered at the beginning of every project. And then lastly, and Kayla had spoke to this as well, that not all knowledge is for everyone. And this is particularly important in the context of open. Kayla, if you could please go to the next slide. After this event, we wanted to keep the conversation going. And so our symposium planning committee team became the editorial team for the upcoming edited volume, Indigenous Knowledges in Open Education. Our goal is to publish an open access volume with chapter contributions from community members, elders, knowledge keepers, students, and academics. Ideally, the volume will contain a variety of chapter formats, including theoretical or conceptual paper essays that are grounded in literature, research papers, and case studies that are critical, evidence-based, or theoretically grounded. The chapter submissions are due March 15th, so only a few days away, but there's still time to submit a proposal. And we've included a link in our slides, which we'll also put in the chat. Oh, I see Brad's already done that. Thank you, Brad, where you can learn more about this call for proposals and learn how to submit a submission. So I believe that's the end of our presentation. We can go to our last slide. Thank you, Kayla. I just want to say thank you to everyone here for attending on behalf of our editorial team. And I think at this time we have the ability to answer questions.
Thank you so much to each of the presenters. And I will say a little bit more at the end, but I think it's really important to turn things over to our audience and participants. So far, I think the couple of questions that have been asked have been addressed by my colleague Joel, and a big thank you to Joel, who's been working in the background, providing links and answering questions as well. And so I think those two have been answered. If they aren't answered completely, just give me a heads up and we'll go from there. So other questions that are coming up for folks at this point? To go along with the question around slides, there will be a recording of this presentation available. And so just watch for an email to all of us in Sask Polytech with that recording, along with the ones that I believe from earlier this week as well. So yes, and I do see one question here. I'll just take a look. Decolonizing/indigenizing feels like a messy process for this and other areas of the library. Do you have any tips to make it less daunting? That's a question I think we all sit with, and wanting to make sure we're not making mistakes and, you know, that are harmful. Yeah.
So I'm going to make a very, very high level comment, not about the libraries. I'll let Kayla and Donna speak to that, but I just wanted to say that I think one of the things that I've learned, a lot from elders and from community members that I've had the privilege of working with across now 4 different institutions, because I've been at UBC Okanagan for less than a year now, and I was at Dalhousie before that, the University of Saskatchewan before that, and the University of Alberta before that. And in all of those contexts, one of the things that they really emphasized is to go in with a sense of humility, that there's lots to learn, that, you know, this is something that is not an immediate fix. This is a long-term engagement to begin to think about what does it mean to change our structures, our curriculum structures, our program structures, our institutional organizational structures, and in ways that actually speak to the principles and that were mentioned earlier, and that the first step of that is actually a commitment to actually engage in building relationships. So relationships are fundamentally critical to this work, and so that's relationships with Indigenous colleagues and students within our institutions, but really emphasizing the importance of building relationships with community, with elders, taking the time to sit and learn. And it is not something that comes immediately. It takes effort, and it is something. So, but I just wanted to emphasize that this idea of kind of centering kind of humility in this work, and then emphasizing kind of being in relationship with community members, with elders, with students and staff and faculty colleagues is critical. And so with that's a super high level comment, but it is I don't know if anybody else on of our group has thoughts specific to libraries, because I think that is actually a really interesting question to think about. Kind of libraries are known to be these repositories of knowledge, so thinking about Indigenous knowledges within that is definitely an ongoing process. So
yeah, and I think within libraries, that's kind of the struggle of libraries, is that we are the stewards of knowledge, but in a lot of cases we're the stewards of knowledges that we actually shouldn't be the stewards of knowledges. There's a very heavy colonial past within libraries that needs to be addressed, and I think that's something that's slowly happening, and especially with amazing allies and more Indigenous librarians entering into the practice, we're seeing kind of a shift in the way that we are speaking about ownership over information, and changing our practices to incorporate community worldviews around knowledge and knowledge sharing. And we're seeing that now with things like the Tri-Council statements, and incorporating into portage data management planning Indigenous knowledges, and taking into context Indigenous knowledges. So one of the things, though, when it comes to kind of starting up projects like these and having really important conversations about open access and open education and where Indigenous knowledges fit in. And the other day I was asked why I think libraries are so slow to start on projects. And it almost goes along what you're saying with humility, Brad. I think we're a lot of cases, unless you have Indigenous colleagues or you are an amazing Indigenous ally like Donna and other folks on this call, is that sometimes there's a fear of doing things wrong and being corrected. And I know I've known Joel for a really long time, and he's probably heard me say this, is that when you're being corrected by an Indigenous community member, it's not because they're mad at you, it's because they respect you and they're building relationships. Being corrected by our relations, by our aunties, is a good thing, because that means that they care for you and they're taking the time to make you a better person. So I always say, for librarians and folks that want to start engaging with communities and doing this, it's okay to make a mistake. I make mistakes on a daily basis in my practice. I am not above making a mistake, but then I need to be humble when I'm being corrected, and understand that that correction is because communities are trying to build relationships. They want you to be a better person. They want you to be a better librarian, or, Brad has a very fancy job, so they want you to be better at your fancy job. So, so that's always my thing, is just don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to reach out and build those relations.
Okay. Oh, yes, that touches my heart, the words that you found for all of that, both of you. We see lots of questions coming in. So the next one is, you mentioned some knowledge is not for sharing. I'm not sure the context of this, or what you mean by that.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess they're wondering sort of the context, and I don't know if you can say more about that specifically, but perhaps.
Can I jump on this, Kayla?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Jump on it.
So this one, I find it always comes up is like, some knowledge isn't for sharing. Like, I think it comes back to, I've done a lot of conversations recently about like consent and organizing and consent and advocacy. And it kind of comes back to this of like, sovereignty is like the supreme right of like to govern yourself as like an Indigenous body, as Indigenous people, and like our knowledge is our right and we have a right to that. So some knowledge we share is not necessarily for academia to take use of and to share in whatever way they want. Kayla and Donna talked about how it's not just like adding it on at the end, it's including it at the start and being intentional in gaining consent. So when you have the consent from Indigenous people on their knowledge, that consent is not continuous. You have to ask for the consent in different forms if you're going to be sharing it. So it's just acknowledging, in my opinion, that Indigenous people have the sovereignty to their knowledge and that their consent is continuous if you do want to share it. And at any point, they can revoke that consent. And if you intend to have a good working relationship in this work with Indigenous peoples, it's respecting that and understanding it. Even if you don't fully understand, ask questions, but don't challenge that decision.
Okay. Thank you
Just
so
to
much,
add that I
Tashia.
think there is an interesting connection that Kayla talked about earlier, which is the sacred. And I think that this idea that a lot of knowledges are sacred. They are gifted from our ancestors and from a creator, and so there is part of this is about our own kind of journey into the sacred, in the same way that I wouldn't want to, my wife is Catholic. I wouldn't want to go out and kind of broadly share a whole bunch of kind of pieces of kind of sacred ceremony that is really rooted in particular types of meaning within the Catholic Church. I think it's important to recognize that sacred element to a lot of the knowledges that we receive, so within many of our communities, most of our elders and our knowledge keepers have gone through a lifetime journey to learn and to begin to understand and be able to teach these knowledges. And so I think until we actually can, until we've committed to that journey ourselves, I think there's a really important part of the humility to actually understand that it's not the same thing as reading a book. Therefore, I can talk about it. It is a much more intimate, sacred process that's built on kind of that long engagement and relational work. And so I thought I should add that too, that I think it is, I have colleagues of mine who are working as professors in universities in Canada, who are actively doing within the Cree community, talk about Escapios, this idea of an elder's helper. That is an actual process that you learn to engage in being a support for an elder and to learning how to actually do ceremony. And this is like, it's like getting your PhD in Indigenous knowledges over many, many years. And that's the journey that people are going through to become knowledge keepers and to be able to kind of share and teach these knowledges. And I think we need to respect that as part of this process. And it goes to that Indigenous sovereignty piece as well that Tashia said. So.
Yeah, and I just wanted, I thank you so much, Tashia and Brad, for sharing and answering that question. I just want to add, I think for those of us who work within the open education community, this is where we can push back against that colonial Eurocentric framework that I think a lot of the, or at least historically, open education conversations have kind of been rooted in, that not all knowledge should be open, that all knowledge should be shared. And so I think it's a responsibility of us working within that community to really push back and disrupt that colonial framework.
Thank you, Donna. And for me, coming from a settler perspective, I just want to say what others graciously are not saying, but I think we, need to own as settlers, that on top of all of this reverence, coming back to that word reverence, that is so necessary in terms of the knowledge, is, the fact that there has been so much taken already, and it's the last thing we should even be considering doing when there's been so much trauma and harm done through taking what is not anyone else's to take. The next question, where are we here? Okay. Can you tell us about some budget information that you have incurred during this amazing project? I'll just say that again. I'm not. Can you tell us about some budget information that you have incurred doing this amazing project? And I'm not sure if the
if by budget information you mean our time, that is about the extent of our budget that is going into this so far. So we are blessed at UBC that UBC really does encourage this work, and so I think all of us have really benefited from being given the green light to spend the time doing some of this work, to actually think about this book project, to engage in this work. I will say that there is with the symposium, the small amounts of costs associated with that. I think our libraries did actually, Donna, you'd have to correct me if I'm wrong there, but I'm pretty sure that the libraries covered the cost of the honorarium for the speakers and elders. For this actual book project, that's one of the reasons why we're really keen to actually create an open access volume, is that this is about walking the talk, if you will, around making sure that this volume is available. There will be some small costs associated with the book project around copy editing and things like that I have volunteered some funding for through the provost office at UBC, but it is actually a very inexpensive project to date. That said, on the OER development side, there's actually significant investment through BC Campus and through UBC around the creation of open educational resources, including those focused on Indigenous knowledges. And so I think there is work that's happening there. We've again been really lucky to have quite substantive grant opportunities through the BC context that has facilitated some of this. But Donna, you might know way more about that because you've helped many people navigate the waters of getting those grants. So. Oh, and I should add, actually, we also, the Indigenous Strategic Plan is a major commitment for our institution. So we are just in the process of adjudicating our first year of Indigenous Strategic Initiatives funding underneath that plan. And we are actually giving out $4 million worth of project funding towards commitments related to our Indigenous Strategic Plan, focused specifically on 6 main priorities around curriculum transformation, around Indigenous community engagement, and around student experience and advancing Indigenous research. So there are, again, that's another major commitment that UBC has made to actually to really demonstrate the commitment to reconciliation through this work. So I will say that, having been at Dalhousie for many years, we did not have $4 million worth of project funding to do this work. So,
Can I just add on? I know Donna will add on too. When we started doing open at UBCO, like UBC Vancouver had established funds, they had established different ways to encourage their instructors to use open. But when we started, that was not the case at UBC Okanagan. We had just got a commitment from the provost office in name that they were committed to open in itself. So it was a slow moving ball. It took us about a year to acquire funding. We were able to secure that, through grants available through the province. So that would be our first step. And we were also able to find little places where open could fit in. So one of the examples is our institution does recognition for, it's called the Golden Apple Award at UBCO. And it's for instructors and professors that alleviate or are able to help students, like how do they positively contribute to your mental well-being and your well-being as a student, and you nominate them. So that was a way that we were able to fit open in there, because open had to do with accessibility and affordability. And so we slowly started to get our faculty involved and kind of excited about this and show that the institution cared. And then with that followed funding and grants. And then with that followed a little bit more funding, and slowly it's grown. And we're very thankful at UBCO for our resources. But for smaller institutions that might not have that, it's definitely where can you look now where money is available and utilizing that towards open.
And just to add to what Tashia said, I think something that's been really helpful for us is having that open education working group with members from units all across, even both campuses. Actually, we have librarians from UBC Vancouver who are on our open education working group. And those meetings have been really significant for exactly the reasons that Tashia was talking about.
Thank you.
There's a side chat happening in the chat that I think, Kayla, it's actually worth talking about it a little bit more. Could you explain what you just typed?
Sure. So there's briefly in the chat, and there was also a question in the Q&A about it because it's fairly popular right now, is about the incorporation of TK labels through the organization local context into OERs and into digital projects. So what the TK labels are is they are along the lines of a Creative Commons license, but as we know, Creative Commons licenses do not necessarily work for Indigenous knowledges and the protocols that go along with Indigenous knowledges. So what local context has done is that they've created different types of licenses and labels that can go on to Indigenous knowledges when they're being presented in things like OERs or digital repositories, so like community websites, things like that. So they have different forms now. So they have the TK labels. Here, I'll just briefly share my screen because it actually makes it easier if I do this. So what they have is they have the TK labels and biocultural labels. The difference with the TK labels now is that these are meant for community members to use. So they have provenance labels. They have protocol labels. So somebody, I believe Jim brought up in the chat, the sacred label here, which could be used to indicate that the knowledge is sacred and not able to be shared. And then there's the permission labels, which are a lot like a Creative Commons label or license. They also have traditional knowledge licenses as well now, which can be used. And then the other one that they have now is different. So they have institutional notices. So this would be for like a university, a library, archive, or museum to use on a collection that would state that they're open to collaborate with the community, or that they don't have complete metadata, so attribution incomplete. Additionally, what they have is the TK notices, which just indicate as well that there's biocultural or traditional knowledge within an item, but it has not been verified by a community. With this as well, one of the new things that they're asking is that individuals either register themselves as a researcher, or if you're working with a community or you're an institution, like the Huichwa Library and Digitization are now knowledge hubs within local context, meaning that they've verified us as hubs to collaborate and share and use the traditional knowledges, or researchers can also become knowledge hubs and use it. But so that's what they're asking. So it's more of the like sharing of information then. So what we've been able to do within Digitization as a knowledge hub is connect to other communities in BC that are also using the TK labels and look at each other's projects and how we are using similar or different TK labels, licenses, notices in the province as well. So it's created like this knowledge hub. They're very knowledgeable. I did see that Jane Anderson, who is the person who's kind of the head of this project, did actually give a presentation somewhere for Open Access Week. I did see her name. They are very open to collaborating with individuals, and their work is absolutely amazing, and it's always moving forward and changing and growing as well. So I definitely recommend folks to read on local context, see how you can be involved with their labels and licenses as well.
Thank you so much. Fortunately, the last two questions, I believe, are ones that we would be able to address when we send out the recording. But if you, I'll leave it to the speakers as to whether you might prefer to address those now. But I know we are at time, and our library leaders may have some guidance for me in terms of whether we need to just end now. And but we will get those answers one way or the other. Preferences?
I must apologize. I actually have to head to another.
Yes, of course.
Commitment
And we
so
want to honor your
I do
time.
apologize,
So
but
I
really do thank everybody for hosting us today. And for being here. It is great to share these ideas, and we really do encourage people to contribute to the book project if you are interested.
Thank you so much. It's just been so rich, and we could be here another couple of hours, I'm sure, at least. And so it's been wonderful to cross paths with each of you. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your expertise with us today. Thank you. So, and thank you everyone for coming. I've already popped that into the chat. And Aidan, should you and I just connect about those other two questions so that our speakers can be on their way? They are obviously very busy people.
Let's do that.
Yeah, we will do that. So I'll just stay on, and thank you so much again. And I would love to be able to have another opportunity to connect. And yeah, it's so much of what you're saying applies to my two projects, and it's one of the things I'm thinking in terms of budget is more time, because it takes time to do things right if we are doing them in the context of decolonization and relationship, and that cannot be pushed and rushed. It should never be. So, and even just in terms of my own learning, I'm learning so much right now. I can't write what I haven't learned yet. Right? I can't do things in a way that I am only learning to embody from what's different than what I've been taught from my childhood. So I just am so grateful. Yeah.
So thanks to each of you for hosting us, and to my colleagues for carrying the heavy burden of the session. I had the fun part of just saying, here's the context of UBC, but it's great to be here today. And I do have to jump because I'm on the hook to present at our Senate Learning and Research Committee in just a minute or two. So I will talk to you all soon. Well,
Thanks, Brad.
bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.